So to start off this deep dive, I want you to just imagine a photograph that's split right down the middle.
Oh, yeah. The one from the source material.
Exactly, that split screen image, because it really sets up everything we're going to talk about today. So on the left side of this picture, you are looking at basically the absolute pinnacle of modern human achievement.
Right, it's that pristine hospital corridor.
Yeah, it's glowing, the lighting is soft, almost architectural, the floors are totally spotless, and you see this smiling healthcare worker gently helping an elderly man use a walker.
It looks incredibly safe.
It does. It looks like the very definition of healing, right?
Yeah, I mean, it represents the promise of healthcare. It's that idealized version of what we all hope is waiting for us, if we ever get sick.
But then your eye drifts over to the right side of this split screen, and the atmosphere completely shifts.
It gets really dystopian, really fast.
Totally dystopian. The lights are flickering, buzzing with that dim fluorescent yellow. The walls are stained. The ward is just packed to the point of claustrophobia.
Beds crammed so close together, you couldn't even fit a chair between them.
Right, exactly, with despairing patients just spilling out into the hallways. And then outside the window, the sky is dominated by this massive, brutalist corporate tower.
With the neon Pharma sign glowing on it.
Yeah, just looming over everything. But the detail that really catches your eye, the thing in the foreground is that all over the floor there are these massive, chaotic piles of spilled pill bottles.
It's a deeply unsettling visual, for sure.
It is.
But, it serves as the perfect anchor for the source material we are unpacking today. We're looking at this really provocative piece published by Podcaster Capital titled, When Healthcare Becomes an Industry Machine.
And our mission today really is to explore the tension between those two halves of the photograph.
Yeah.
We're going to look at what happens when the miracle of modern medicine, and let's be clear right up front, it is a miracle, right?
Oh, absolutely.
But what happens when that miracle stops serving the patient and starts serving systems and bureaucracy and throughput and shareholders?
And that caveat you just made is so crucial. The text we are analyzing today, it doesn't indulge in any of that anti-science rhetoric.
Right.
It totally recognizes that modern medicine, sterile surgery, the development of antibiotics, emergency trauma care, mRNA technology, these are monumental triumphs.
They've literally doubled human life expectancy.
Exactly. So we aren't critiquing the science here. We are taking an impartial, really analytical look at the machinery that delivers that science.
Because reading through these sources, the feeling you get isn't that, doctors are malicious or that medicine is a lie.
No, not at all.
It's more like looking at a hyper-advanced car factory.
Oh, I like that analogy.
Yeah, the robotic arms are incredibly precise, the lasers welding the chassis are state-of-the-art. But if the management of that factory suddenly becomes utterly obsessed with just the speed of the assembly line...
Right, just pushing metal out the door to meet a quarterly quota.
Exactly. Then the quality control inevitably collapses. They stop caring if the brakes actually work, so long as the car rolls off the line on schedule.
And in this framework, the cars rolling off the assembly line are human beings.
Right.
And the speed of the line is patient throughput. When you optimize a medical system solely for speed and financial efficiency, the first major symptom you see is what the authors call the pill-first default.
Which links directly back to those scattered pill bottles on the right side of our image.
Exactly. It's the incredibly common experience of walking into a clinic and walking out maybe 10 minutes later with a prescription for a pill you barely even understand.
So let's unpack the mechanics of why that actually happens.
Sure.
Because the text points out that we often want to blame the doctor, right? We just assume they don't care.
Right. Which is usually not the case.
No, the reality is a lot more complex and, frankly, a lot more structural. It's almost like software engineers dealing with technical debt.
Okay, walk me through that.
So when a programmer is under a massive time crunch to get an app working by a deadline, they write messy, quick code. It fixes the immediate bug, but it creates this tangled mess that will inevitably crash the whole system later. Okay, I see. They don't do it because they're bad coders. They do it because the system didn't give them time to write clean code.
Yeah, that technical debt metaphor maps perfectly onto the primary care clinic. Let's break down the 15-minute appointment constraint, because that right there is the engine of the pill-first default.
Right.
In a lot of modern healthcare systems, a primary care physician's schedule is dictated by billing metrics. Often these are calculated in something called relative value units, or RVUs.
RVUs, right.
Yeah, so doctors are pressured by hospital administration to see a really high volume of patients just to generate enough RVUs to cover the clinic's overhead.
So the doctor is essentially on a treadmill.
Exactly.
They open the door and they have maybe 10, maybe 15 minutes tops. And in that time, they have to greet the patient, review a convoluted electronic medical record, figure out the diagnosis, type out their notes for billing compliance, and come up with a treatment plan.
Right. Now, imagine a patient comes in with high blood pressure, mild anxiety, and chronic fatigue.
Which is super common.
Incredibly common. And those symptoms are often the result of complex lifestyle factors. We're talking poor diet, chronic workplace stress, maybe sleep apnea, or even social isolation.
Yeah.
Unraveling all of that requires a deep, probing conversation. The doctor has to ask about what the patient eats, what their home life is like, how they sleep.
Mm-hmm.
It requires building essentially a 6-month behavioral intervention plan.
Which you physically cannot do in 12 minutes while clicking through drop-down menus on a laptop.
No, it's impossible.
But you know what you can do in 12 minutes?
Write a prescription.
Exactly. You can write a prescription for a beta blocker for the blood pressure and maybe a mild sedative for the anxiety. It stops the immediate alarm bells. It's that quick code that gets the app running for today.
And the structural pressure actively forces that outcome. Plus, the billing system itself actively rewards treatment over prevention.
How so?
Well, there's a specific, highly lucrative billing code for performing a procedure, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there's a clear code for managing a prescription. But if a doctor spends 45 minutes counseling a pre-diabetic patient on nutrition and exercise to prevent them from needing insulin.
The system doesn't really pay for that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The system often has no way to properly compensate the clinic for that time. It only pays when you do something to the patient, not when you talk to them.
Wow. And, you know, if you're listening to this and thinking, well, I actually prefer the quick fix, you aren't alone.
Right. Patient psychology plays a huge role here.
It does. Because if I go to the doctor, I'm taking time off work, I'm paying a copay, I want tangible proof that the visit was worth it.
Right. You want a takeaway.
Yeah. A piece of paper with a prescription feels like a solution. If a doctor just tells me to sleep more and eat less sodium, I might actually feel dismissed, like they didn't do anything for me.
And the environment we live in heavily conditions that expectation.
Oh, totally.
The source material highlights the sheer volume of pharmaceutical marketing the average citizen absorbs. Direct-to-consumer advertising.
Oh, man, those commercials.
Yeah, the ones where people are running happily through a field while a really fast voiceover rattles off a dozen terrifying side effects.
Right.
Those commercials aren't just selling a specific drug, they're selling a mindset. They're teaching the public to view every vague human discomfort as a biochemical deficiency that requires a patented chemical solution.
That's a great point.
So by the time a patient actually sits on the exam table, they're often already primed to demand a specific medication.
Which just creates this massive vicious cycle.
Exactly.
The patient demands the quick fix, the doctor doesn't have the time to argue or explore alternatives, and the billing system just rewards the transaction.
Right.
But we have to ask, what is the actual biological cost of this technical debt? Because the text makes it very clear that popping a pill for everything isn't some victimless shortcut.
Oh, definitely not. The cascade of negative effects is profound, and it really begins with polypharmacy.
Polypharmacy, so
That's the simultaneous use of multiple drugs by a single patient.
Mm-hmm.
Let's trace how this happens mechanically. A patient is prescribed drug A to treat a symptom. Drug A causes a side effect, perhaps gastrointestinal distress.
Right.
Instead of reevaluating drug A, the rushed system just prescribes drug B to manage the stomach issue.
Oh, I see where this is going.
Right. Then drug B causes drowsiness, so drug C is added to keep them awake.
And before you know it, you end up with elderly patients taking 12 different pills a day, half of which are literally just treating the side effects of the other half.
Exactly. And when you mix that many synthetic compounds in a single human liver,
Yeah.
the drug interactions become entirely unpredictable.
Wow.
We see a massive surge in dependency risks. We see cognitive decline in older adults that gets mistaken for dementia when it's actually medication toxicity.
Wait, really? Medication toxicity mimicking dementia?
Yes, it happens all the time.
Yeah.
And dangerous physical falls, too. From an economic standpoint, the public health system is just bled dry, continuously looking for symptom management, while the underlying chronic diseases just continue to progress unchecked.
That is wild. So how do we restructure the clinic to avoid that? Because the source outlines a completely different paradigm, right?
It does.
Yeah.
It suggests changing the baseline series of questions a medical professional asks before the prescription pad ever comes out.
Okay, so what's the new baseline?
Well, this proposed human-centered model introduces a necessary friction into the assembly line. The first question is no longer, what drug treats this?
Right.
It becomes, can this be prevented?
Hmm.
If the answer is no, then the next question is, can behavior change or physical therapy help?
Right.
If no, is there a non-pharmacological option? And only when all of those are exhausted or, in acute emergencies, does the medication become the default.
Shifting that baseline seems incredibly difficult in practice, though.
It does, but the text argues it could single-handedly rebuild patient trust. It moves the patient from feeling like a processed widget on a conveyor belt to feeling like an active participant in their own health.
Right. But, that leads us right into a much thornier issue.
Oh, the money.
The money. Because if the current system is churning out millions of these pills every single day, someone is paying for them.
Right.
And someone is making an astronomical amount of money.
We absolutely have to look at the financial architecture underneath the clinic. The money machine.
Let's dive into the economics, specifically what the text calls the paying twice dilemma.
Yes.
Because this is where the average taxpayer gets incredibly frustrated. The common narrative that we always hear is that drug companies deserve to charge whatever they want because they take on all the risk of inventing the drugs.
Right, that's the standard industry talking point.
But the source material paints a very different picture of how early-stage research actually works.
It does. The public is rarely aware of how deeply their tax dollars actually subsidize the foundational stages of medical breakthroughs.
Right.
Before a pharmaceutical company ever runs a clinical trial, decades of basic scientific research have to occur. Scientists need to map the human genome. They need to understand the molecular structure of a virus or identify a specific protein pathway that causes a tumor to grow.
And that kind of basic exploratory science is incredibly risky.
Right.
And super expensive.
Exactly. And private corporations typically do not fund it because the return on investment is decades away and is highly uncertain.
So who pays for it?
The public. Taxpayers fund massive agencies like the National Institutes of Health, which in turn give billions of dollars in grants to university researchers. These public laboratories do the heavy lifting of discovering the core biological mechanisms.
Okay, I really want to make sure I understand the mechanism here.
Sure.
So the public takes on the high-risk, early-stage financial burden. A university lab, funded by my taxes, discovers a molecule that shrinks tumors. What happens next?
A private pharmaceutical company will often purchase the patent or the licensing rights to that molecule from the university. The company then takes on the later stage risk. They fund the human clinical trials, they navigate the FDA approval process, and they scale up the manufacturing.
Which, to be fair, is undeniably expensive. Let's be impartial here. Running a phase 3 clinical trial across thousands of patients costs hundreds of millions of dollars. And the text explicitly acknowledges that profit isn't inherently evil and that innovation does require private capital.
That is a vital point to make. The text does not advocate for abolishing private pharma.
Right.
The real contention arises when that drug finally reaches the pharmacy counter.
Why?
Because the company now holds a monopoly on the drug, they can set the price at astronomical levels. So the taxpayer, who literally funded the foundational discovery, goes to the pharmacy and is asked to pay an inflated price for a drug their own tax dollars helped invent.
Wow.
And that is the paying twice dilemma.
Okay, I'd actually push back on that slightly, or at least play devil's advocate for a second.
Go for it.
If I help fund the construction of a highway with my taxes, I still have to pay the trucking company if I want them to deliver a package to my house, right? The trucking company did the final mile of work. Why shouldn't a drug company charge whatever the market will bear for doing the final mile of medical development?
That's a great question. And it comes down to a concept in economics called inelastic demand.
Inelastic demand, okay.
Right. So in your highway example, if the trucking company charges too much, you can choose to drive to the store yourself, or use a different delivery company, or simply decide you don't really need the package.
Right, I have options.
You have agency as a consumer. But healthcare does not operate in a free market because the demand for life-saving medicine is perfectly inelastic.
Meaning you can't walk away from the negotiation table.
Exactly. If you have type 1 diabetes and the price of insulin suddenly triples, you cannot simply opt out of buying insulin.
No, you'll die.
You will die. If your child has a rare leukemia, you will sell your house, you will empty your retirement accounts, and you'll go into massive debt to buy the drug that cures them.
Yeah.
Pharmaceutical companies know this. The market forces that normally keep prices fair competition and the consumer's ability to just walk away, They simply do not exist for sick people.
Man, that makes the mechanics of drug pricing so crucial to understand. And the text points out that these prices aren't just high, they are deliberately obscured.
Very much so.
I read the section on pharmacy benefit managers, or PBMs, and it honestly felt like reading about a shadow economy.
It really does.
Can you explain how a PBM actually functions? Because this seems to be where a lot of the money just disappears.
Yeah, PBMs are arguably the most powerful and least understood entities in the entire healthcare supply chain.
Okay.
A great way to think of a PBM is like a ruthless bouncer at an exclusive high-end nightclub.
Okay, I'm listening.
So the nightclub is the formulary. That's the official list of drugs that an insurance company will agree to cover. Pharmaceutical companies desperately want their drugs inside that club.
Right, because if it's not covered, nobody buys it.
Exactly. If a drug isn't covered by insurance, patients can't afford it and the drug fails.
So the PBM stands at the door with a clipboard.
Right. The drug manufacturer comes to the bouncer and says, "Hey, let my drug into the club." And the PBM says, "I'll let you in, but you have to pay me a massive secret rebate." Basically a kickback.
A kickback, wow.
Yeah. The drug company agrees to pay the rebate, but to protect their own profit margins, they artificially inflate the list price of the drug.
Oh, wow. So if a pill costs $10 to make, the company might originally want to sell it for $20, but the PBM demands a $30 kickback just to put it on the insurance list.
Exactly.
So the drug company raises the official price of the pill to $50, the insurance company pays the PBM takes their cut, and the drug company gets their profit. But wait, what happens to a patient who doesn't have great insurance, or who has a really high deductible?
That patient walks up to the pharmacy counter and is forced to pay the artificially inflated list price of $50, totally out of pocket.
That is brutal.
They are literally subsidizing the kickbacks occurring in the shadows. The entire system is designed to extract maximum revenue by obfuscating the true cost of the goods.
This is exactly why the source material's proposed reforms are so heavily focused on transparency and legal mechanisms.
Right.
Because we clearly can't rely on the goodwill of corporations. We need structural changes. Let's look at the patent thicket issue, because this absolutely blew my mind.
That's fascinating.
I always thought a patent lasted 20 years, and then cheaper generic versions were allowed to just flood the market and drive the price down.
Well, that was the original intention of patent law. A 20-year monopoly to reward the inventor, followed by open competition. But pharmaceutical companies have developed these incredibly sophisticated legal strategies to game this system, creating what they call patent thickets.
Patent thickets?
Yeah. So as the original patent nears its expiration date, the company will file dozens of new secondary patents on minor, often scientifically insignificant modifications to the drug.
The texts actually give a crazy example of this. You don't even have to change the medicine itself, right?
Nope.
If it's an asthma medicine, you just change the plastic mechanism of the inhaler that delivers it. Or you change the inactive coating on the pill so it dissolves 5 minutes slower.
Exactly. You patent the new coating, you patent the specific manufacturing process used to apply the coating, and then you heavily market and transition all your patients to this new and improved version.
Wow.
So when generic competitors try to enter the market with the original drug, the pharmaceutical company unleashes an army of lawyers to sue them for infringing on this thicket of secondary patents.
Unbelievable.
It ties the generic companies up in court for years, effectively extending the monopoly long past that original 20-year limit.
So how do we fix this? Because the authors don't just complain, they actually offer a blueprint.
They do.
They call for strict anti-monopoly enforcement to invalidate these frivolous patents, and they call for fair return clauses.
Right.
Meaning, if a university lab discovers a compound using tax dollars, the licensing agreement legally mandates that the resulting drug must be priced affordably for the domestic population.
They also advocate for public interest licensing during emergencies.
Like during a pandemic.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Think back to a global pandemic. If millions of lives are at risk and a publicly subsidized vaccine is developed, a single company should not be allowed to bottleneck the global supply just to maximize their quarterly earnings.
Right.
Governments need the authority to license that formula to multiple manufacturing hubs worldwide to scale up production instantly.
Yeah, it's really about rebalancing the scales. But as we move from the financial architecture back to the physical reality of healthcare, the source material takes a very, very dark turn.
It does.
Because when you squeeze the budgets this hard and you optimize everything for profit and throughput, it doesn't just empty the patient's wallet, it physically degrades the actual building they are sitting in.
Right. We are returning to the last, well, rather the right side of our split screen photo.
The dirty side.
The stained walls, the crowded hallways. The text calls this the danger within the walls.
And if you're listening to this, you've probably felt this specific anxiety. I know I have. You walk into a hospital to visit a relative, and instead of feeling comforted, you feel this low-level dread. You look at a smudge on the wall, or you notice the airflow feels stagnant, and you wonder, am I going to catch something worse in here than what I came in with?
Nosocomial infections, which are infections acquired in a hospital setting, they are a massive, often underreported global crisis.
But the text is exceptionally careful to direct the blame where it actually belongs here.
Yes.
When a hospital ward is dirty, the public instinct is often to blame the janitorial staff. But the text fiercely defends the environmental services workers.
It does. It points out that these workers are given absolutely impossible quotas. If an administration cuts the cleaning staff budget to boost their margins, you might have one person assigned to clean 30 patient rooms in an hour.
Which is physically impossible to do well.
Right. You have to look at the physical mechanics of a hospital turnaround. When a patient is discharged, the room needs to be sterilized. The bed rails, the IV poles, the remote controls, the bathroom fixtures, all of it.
Yeah.
And it needs to be treated with heavy-duty chemical disinfectants that often require a specific dwell time.
Dwell time.
Yeah, the chemical needs to sit wet on the surface for 3 to 5 minutes to actually break down the cellular walls of the pathogens.
Oh, wow. But if the cleaner is given exactly 4 minutes to strip the bed, mop the floor, and clean the bathroom before the next patient is wheeled in,
that necessary dwell time simply cannot happen.
Right.
The failure is not the worker's work ethic. The failure is an institutional neglect of physical infrastructure.
And this institutional neglect creates a terrifying synergy with our first topic today, the overprescription of pills.
Yes, this is where the biological mechanisms get truly frightening.
Let's connect those dots. How does prescribing too many antibiotics in a 15-minute clinic visit lead to a crisis in a dirty hospital room?
It comes down to evolutionary pressure.
Okay.
When we use antibiotics indiscriminately, like prescribing them for viral colds where they do absolutely nothing, or dumping thousands of tons of them into agricultural animal feed, we act as an evolutionary filter for bacteria.
Right.
We kill off all the weak, susceptible bacteria in the environment. But in any population of billions of bacteria, a few will possess a random genetic mutation that allows them to survive the drug.
It might have an enzyme that breaks the antibiotic down?
Exactly. Or a cellular pump that physically ejects the drug from the cell before it can even work.
Yeah.
Those survivors now have no competition for resources, so they multiply rapidly, passing that resistant gene to their offspring. We have inadvertently engineered superbugs that are completely immune to our strongest pharmaceutical weapon.
So you have these highly evolved, weaponized superbugs existing in the population. Now, introduce that pathogen into an aging, dirty hospital.
The environment is perfectly primed for catastrophe.
Yeah.
You have an outdated ventilation system that doesn't cycle the air enough times per hour, essentially just pushing contaminated air from an infected room out into the hallway.
Right.
You have porous building materials from the 1970s that are impossible to fully sanitize. You have overcrowding where beds are lined up in corridors, destroying any concept of physical isolation. And you have an understaffed cleaning crew.
The source text highlights a specific, chilling example of this nightmare scenario, Candida auris.
Yes.
And what makes this so terrifying is that it isn't even a bacteria, it's a fungus.
Right. Candida auris is a masterclass in microbial adaptation. Fungal pathogens are inherently more difficult to treat than bacteria because fungi are eukaryotes.
Eukaryotes, meaning?
Meaning, at a cellular level, their biology is much closer to human cells than bacterial cells are. It's incredibly difficult to design a drug that kills the fungal cell without also causing severe toxicity to the human patient's cells.
And Candida auris has evolved to thrive specifically in human healthcare environments.
It has. It is an opportunistic predator. It doesn't typically harm healthy people just walking around outside. But inside a hospital, it preys on the most vulnerable.
Right.
It targets patients with central IV lines, urinary catheters, or those on mechanical ventilators. It colonizes the skin. And worst of all, it has this unprecedented ability to survive on cold, dry, inanimate surfaces like plastic bed rails, blood pressure cuffs, touch screens for weeks or even months.
That is horrifying. If an outdated hospital ward gets colonized by Candida auris, the text notes that sometimes the only way to eradicate it is to literally rip the room down to the studs.
Yeah, you can't just mop it away.
And this fungus is increasingly resistant to all three major classes of antifungal drugs.
Which is why the World Health Organization's warning, cited in the source material, frames antimicrobial resistance as a slow-moving existential threat.
Yeah.
If we lose the ability to fight off simple infections, the entire edifice of modern medicine collapses. You can't perform an organ transplant or routine joint replacements or administer chemotherapy if the patient's immune system is suppressed in a building teeming with untreatable superbugs.
It really forces a massive paradigm shift in how administrators need to view hospital maintenance.
It does.
Upgrading the HVAC system to high-efficiency HEPA filtration, installing negative pressure rooms where air is sucked in rather than pushed out, transitioning to antimicrobial copper surfaces. These are not, like, aesthetic upgrades.
No, they're core medical interventions.
Right. Preserving the physical sanctity of the hospital is the only way we preserve the efficacy of the drugs we still have.
But if we fail to do that, if the patient is processed through a rushed clinic, prescribed unnecessary drugs, financially squeezed by opaque billing, and placed in a contaminated hospital bed, we reach the absolute nadir of this industrial machinery. We arrive at what the text calls the ultimate human cost.
And this brings us to the most sobering section of our deep dive.
Yeah.
We need to look at what happens to the most defenseless members of society when they are caught in a system that is just optimized for throughput and cost reduction. Specifically, we need to talk about the end of life.
The source material addresses the ethics of end-of-life care with profound gravity. It acknowledges that across the globe, societies have vastly different legal frameworks and cultural beliefs regarding palliative care and assisted dying.
Right.
Our goal today is not to debate the legality of those frameworks, but to examine the universal ethical baseline the text demands.
Right, because the author draws an absolute non-negotiable red line here. Regardless of what country you are in, no human being should ever be pressured, manipulated, deprived of care, or economically nudged into death.
Let's unpack that phrase, economically nudged, because the mechanics of it are incredibly insidious.
Yeah, it rarely looks like overt villainy.
Right. It looks like an elderly patient suffering from a chronic illness, looking at the mounting stack of hospital bills on their kitchen table.
Or it looks like an insurance company denying coverage for an expensive in-home palliative care nurse, but fully covering a lethal prescription.
Exactly. Or it's the psychological weight of feeling like a burden. The text makes a devastating point. If a disabled, poor, or isolated person feels that their sheer existence is ruining their family's financial future, society has failed them long before any medical decision is even made.
The authors argue that autonomy is an illusion if the choices are artificially constrained by a broken system.
Right.
If a patient chooses to end their life primarily because they cannot access adequate pain management, or because they are terrified of bankrupting their children, that is not a free medical choice.
No, that is a systemic failure of societal support masquerading as individual autonomy.
True dignity, as defined by the source material, requires massive, comprehensive support.
Yes.
It requires aggressive, state-of-the-art pain relief, so no one suffers unnecessarily. It requires robust mental health counseling to address the deep depression that often accompanies terminal diagnoses. And it requires social companions, ensuring that people do not face their final days in terrifying isolation.
And only when all of those factors are guaranteed, when the patient is completely free from pain, isolation, and financial terror, can any conversation about end-of-life choices be considered ethically sound.
Right.
In an industrial healthcare system that views elderly patients with complex needs as a drain on resources, the risk of subtly coercing the vulnerable becomes unacceptably high.
This is actually where the author brings in a historical analogy that completely stopped me in my tracks.
Of the Geneva Protocol part?
Yeah, they suddenly pivot to talking about the 1925 Geneva Protocol and the Chemical Weapons Convention. I read that and I thought, why on earth are we injecting international war treaties into a discussion about hospital ethics?
It is a profound philosophical leap, I admit. But if you look at the underlying logic, it is incredibly powerful.
Walk us through it.
The text asks us to examine the psychological mechanism behind those treaties. Human beings invented war, which is the institutionalization of mass violence. But even in the darkest, most brutal depths of World War I, after witnessing the horrors of mustard gas and chlorine gas, the international community experienced a collective moral revulsion.
They realized they had crossed a line that should never be crossed, even against an enemy combatant.
Exactly. The global community came together and codified a principle. There are limits to the suffering we are allowed to inflict on a human body.
Right.
Some methods of destruction, like chemical and biological agents, strip away human dignity so entirely, so indiscriminately, that they must be universally outlawed, regardless of military necessity.
So how does that map onto a modern hospital setting?
The author argues that if humanity possesses the moral capacity to establish absolute red lines in the midst of total war, we must demand even stronger, more unshakable red lines in times of peace, specifically within the institutions designed for healing.
Wow, yeah.
If war logic eventually treats humans as disposable meat for the grinder, healthcare logic must be its absolute antithesis. Medicine must represent an unyielding defense of human dignity, protection, and restraint. Rejecting the logic that humans are disposable is the core philosophical requirement of a functional medical system.
Think about what that actually means for a moment. If you fail to reject that disposable logic, if you allow patients to be treated like products on a failing assembly line, you don't just harm individual bodies.
Right.
You destroy the single invisible element that the entire edifice of medicine rests upon. You destroy trust.
Trust is the ultimate casualty of the industrial machine. And the source material frames trust not as an abstract feeling, but as hard infrastructure.
I really love this metaphor. The author says trust is infrastructure. It is as vital to public health as the concrete in a dam, or the copper wire in a power grid, or the pipes in a municipal water system. We don't think about the water pipes under our street until a main breaks and our tap runs brown. And we don't think about trust until it collapses.
You have to look at how public health practically functions on a macro level. If a brilliant scientist develops a life-saving vaccine during a pandemic, the physical vial of liquid is useless if the citizen refuses to let a nurse inject it into their arm.
Right. The science doesn't matter if nobody takes it.
Exactly. And the citizen will only consent if they trust that the regulatory agencies properly vetted it, and that the pharmaceutical company prioritized safety over a quick profit.
When a patient endures the gauntlet we've discussed today, the rushed 15-minute appointment, the confusing $5,000 surprise bill 6 months later, the fear of an unclean hospital, the news stories of corporate lobbying, the psychological contract just shatters.
And when that infrastructure of trust breaks down, the public health consequences are immediate and severe. Patients delay seeking preventative care because they don't want to deal with the friction of the system. This turns easily treatable conditions into terminal emergencies. Furthermore, they turn to alternative sources for healing.
Oh, the internet.
Yes, the internet is flooded with conspiracy theories, unregulated supplements, and medical disinformation, all of which rush in to fill the void left by a system that refuses to listen to its patients.
So how do we lay new pipes? How do we rebuild that infrastructure of trust? The source material doesn't leave us in despair, right?
No, it maps out a comprehensive 6-step model to transition healthcare from an industry machine into what they beautifully call a healing commons.
Let's weave through these solutions, looking at how they practically alter the patient experience we've been critiquing.
Sure.
The first shift requires tackling the pill-first default through a rigorous commitment to rational prescribing and deprescribing.
Deprescribing is a fascinating concept. It's not just stopping cold turkey.
Right. How does that practically work for a patient who has been on 5 different medications for a decade?
It requires intense, personalized medical management. The body achieves a state of homeostasis with these chemicals.
Okay.
If a patient has been on proton pump inhibitors for years for acid reflux and they suddenly stop, their stomach will mass produce acid in a severe rebound effect.
Oh.
Yeah. Deprescribing requires a doctor to work with the patient over months, slowly tapering dosages, monitoring withdrawal symptoms, and replacing the pharmacological intervention with dietary changes or physical therapy. It is slow, careful, restorative medicine.
Which naturally requires the second solution, human-centered care.
Yes.
You cannot do complex deprescribing in 15 minutes. The system must fundamentally restructure its economic incentives to value time.
We need to change the billing codes. If a doctor spends 45 minutes deeply exploring a patient's mental health and lifestyle, that must be compensated as highly, if not higher, than a quick surgical procedure.
Yeah.
We have to make listening a financially viable clinical practice.
Right. And the third piece is the physical environment. Clean, modern hospitals. Treating the building itself as medicine.
This involves significant capital expenditure, but the long-term savings are astronomical. Upgrading ventilation, redesigning wards to allow for true isolation of highly infectious patients, and vastly increasing the budgets and staffing levels for environmental services. We have to build physical spaces where superbugs have nowhere to hide.
Fourth is transparent funding. If we are going to fix the paying twice dilemma, we need sunshine on the entire financial supply chain.
Citizens must have access to open databases showing exactly which university research grants led to which commercial patents. We need to legally mandate that PBMs, those bouncers at the club we talked about,
Right, the bouncers.
they must disclose all their negotiated rebates so the public knows the true cost of a drug.
Fifth, public interest science. This is where we implement those fair return clauses.
Yes.
If the public's tax dollars fund the risky early-stage science, the resulting drug must be priced affordably for the public. It ensures that innovation is rewarded, but exploitation is prevented.
Finally, we need strong ethics safeguards. This is the ultimate defense of human dignity.
Yeah.
Establishing robust, fully independent review boards for all end-of-life care decisions. Ensuring that palliative care, mental health support, and pain management are universally accessible and fully funded, so no patient ever chooses death because they feel they are an economic burden.
The authors frame this entire deep dive as a stark crossroads for society. We have built the most technologically advanced medical science in human history, but now we have to choose how we deploy it.
Exactly.
Will it be an industrial machine, obsessed with margins, treating people as codes and revenue streams? Or will it be a healing commons, built on the infrastructure of trust, treating people as whole, dignified human beings?
As the text astutely points out, you cannot trick the patient. The public senses the difference the moment they walk through the clinic doors. They know when they're being healed, and they know when they're being processed.
We've covered a massive amount of ground today. We started with the clinical reality of the 15-minute appointment and the technical debt of overprescription. We followed the money to the PBMs, the patent thickets, and the paying twice dilemma. We looked at the physical decay of hospitals, the terrifying biology of Candida auris, and the profound ethical necessity of protecting human dignity at the end of life.
And we must end where we began, reiterating that this critique is born out of a deep reverence for medicine.
Absolutely.
We examine the flaws in the machinery because the science is too precious to be lost to institutional greed. The goal is a system worthy of the miracles it provides.
And that leaves me with a thought I want you, the listener, to carry with you. We spent a lot of time discussing trust as public infrastructure. Think about the water pipes in your city. You don't wait until the pipes burst to start debating how to fix them. You maintain them when the water is flowing.
Yeah.
So, ask yourself, what happens when the next global health crisis hits a society where that infrastructure of trust has already crumbled? How do we start acting like a healing commons today? The next time you are sitting in a sterile waiting room or trying to decipher a convoluted medical bill, how can you advocate for transparency and demand the time you deserve? We have to start demanding the maintenance of our medical trust before we desperately need it to survive. Thanks for exploring the machinery with us on this deep dive.